Well, hello. I'm back from holiday, and of course our first order of business will be to discuss the newest Mothership 10 Moonlit Seduction. This has obviously been in the house for quite a few days now because I ordered it on release day with express shipping, but I was on holiday. I just came back yesterday, so that explains why this video is a little bit late, but you are already all aware of that because I did warn you about it in my previous video. So today we're going to test out the palette together. I'm going to swatch it. I'm going to do two different looks because it's Saturday. I don't have to go anywhere, so I can do two different looks on each of my eyes. We're going to talk quite extensively about the new formula of the special shades, and I am going to also give you some comparison swatches to eyeshadows that I feel are similar in her collection without really going overboard with that. First things first, there were a lot of expectations with Mothership 10 because it being the 10th palette kind of implied that it's going to be something spectacular. Obviously the term spectacular is open to debate because what is spectacular to me may not at all be spectacular to you. I was very happy with the inspo images on Pat McGrath's Instagram before the palette was released because they were alluding to a somewhat more neutral color story, and honestly, based on what I have seen from this eyeshadow palette so far, it does look like a cool-toned, neutral color story. Moonlit Seduction, so the moon and the light that shines off of the moon is the inspiration behind this palette, which I think is really cool. I love how she always draws inspiration from so many different sources, and I hope she continues to do so in the future. This packaging is essentially the packaging from the Utopian Dream palette, but with some small details changed here and there. I wanted to mention something really important for my fellow Europeans here. I'm based in the Netherlands, so I purchased the palette off of Pat McGrath's website on release day. The palette cost 150 or 155 euros. That was like the whole price, no additional costs included. And I got a 10% off because obviously she always has a 10% off on release day. In one of my previous videos I said that I couldn't really explain why this huge increase in price has happened because for Americans the palette has basically only increased in price with $3, and we went from like 130-ish euros to 150 euros, which is quite the jump. I have a perfectly logical explanation for that, you guys. It's just that we benefited quite a bit without really thinking too hard about it in the past from the fact that the dollar and the euro were not equally worthy. The value of the euro for quite a few years was higher, so it was more valuable than the dollar. So when we purchased things in dollars, they were quite cheap for us in euros. That sadly isn't the case anymore because now the euro and the dollar are basically equal, which is what has led to this increase in price. Because something that used to cost $125 and was around 115 euros now costs 125 euros. Or 128 euros. And on Pat's website you prepay for the custom and import taxes, and to the Netherlands custom taxes are around 21%, so that's where you get to the 150 euros. I checked on Douglas, which is a retailer here in Europe and in the Netherlands who sells Pat McGrath Labs, and on their website the Mothership palettes were still 125 euros. I don't know whether that's because they still have older stock or because for some reason they are able to bypass the custom and import taxes. So if you have patience, just wait for the palette to come to Douglas and then wait for the 20% off sale, and then you will be able to get it for a much cheaper price. Obviously I couldn't wait because I am such a sucker for Pat McGrath. I hate the word stan, but I think it is the only way to describe me. I'm part of her stan. So without further ado, I think we are going to swatch the eyeshadows, and I'm going to do looks, and we're going to talk about the different formulas. According to Pat's own description, there are 7 different formulas in here. I don't know that my tactile senses are sensitive enough to detect 7 different formulas in here, but without further ado, I'm going to show you the palette, which I'm sure you've already seen plenty of times. So here is Moonlit Seduction in like pure daylight. I don't have any sort of artificial lighting on, and this is how she looks like up close and personal. What I'm going to do is I'm going to swatch these 6 shades, and we're going to swatch the corner here of the 4 special formulas after that. So I'm just going to go in row from like the Skin Show shade up to the Platinum Dusk shade, and then from Extreme Nocturne to Plum Cabaret. Oh, there is one other general thing that I wanted to talk about because it bugs me a little bit. People are constantly complaining that Pat's been releasing pink palettes over and over again. And you know what? She hasn't. She's been releasing palettes that are very, very different from each other. If you look from Divine Rose 1 all the way up till here, the only truly pink palette is Eternal Eden, which was released for Valentine's Day 2021. All the other palettes actually aren't pink. They have some pink accents here and there, but they aren't actually pink. They're quite different from each other, except, and this is where Pat McGrath has really fucked herself over and like put herself in like the teeniest, tiniest corner, is there is always some sort of a variation of a plum matte and something rosy in like the matte section of her eyeshadow palettes, which makes people feel like they're getting pink palettes over and over again. It creates the illusion that you're constantly getting eyeshadow palettes which are themed around pink, because everyone starts their look off with the matte shades. And when you lay down a plum shade, all of your looks are kind of going to always be leaning towards the plummy side. They're always going to end up more or less similar to each other. Because the matter of fact is that a plum shade is much more limiting than a brown shade. So, and I said this in the video where we talked about the reveal of the palette, but in a perfect world, instead of this plum matte, we would have gotten this shade. This is the shade Statuesque, which is one of her singles. She doesn't really have that shade in an eyeshadow palette, which is a bummer because it would have fit absolutely perfectly in this color story. I could even forgive the shade Rosewood Romantic, so this one here, because it has interesting tones to it, like it has like a browny terracotta tone to it, which I like. I would not necessarily change the tone of this shade, but oh my gosh, if we could change that plum shade to have been Statuesque, all of our hopes and dreams for getting the perfect cool tone neutral palette with a glam twist to it would have come true. I truly think that is the reason people have been so mad about her releasing pink palettes over and over again. It's not that she's been releasing pink palettes. Cover the plums in a bunch of her palettes and you will quickly realize that they're so incredibly different from each other. So incredibly different from each other. But unfortunately she keeps putting those stupid plum mattes, and don't get me wrong, a plum matte is beautiful, but a plum matte is a very specific tone of eyeshadow, and to be frank with you, it's not one that is particularly flattering for everyone. Like, there are a lot of shades of plum that I cannot pull off because they make me feel tired and is if I have a bruise. So actually I'm a little bit scared of the plum shade in here because I think it's going to do the same. I also wanted to mention that I am absolutely going to do a week of Moonlit Seduction. So after this video we will come back and do a week of looks with this palette. However, unlike previous times when I've done this only using the palette in question, this time I'm not going to do it. I'm going to definitely be pulling out for Statuesque or for Subliminal or any other palette that I feel like has mattes that would make my looks somewhat different from each other. I don't want my looks to all be plum and rosewood. Wow, I was going to start swatching like 10 minutes ago. Okay, let's start swatching. The first shade that we are going to swatch is Skin Tense Glow, which is, you know, the typical champagne shade that she always includes in her palettes. Honestly, this is a nice one. It doesn't really lean too pink or too yellow. It's kind of quite well balanced, so I don't really mind it. Next, we're going to swatch Rosewood Romantic, which is one of the three mattes in this palette, which, like I mentioned, looks like a rosewood terracotta brownie type of shade. In terms of formula, this matte feels pretty consistent with what we've been getting in the past, like 2 or 3 Mothership palettes, which are very beautiful, creamy, soft mattes. They are not as hard-pressed and hard in the pan as they used to be in the past. Beautiful, beautiful formula. It's going to blend out really easy and it's not super powdery. Next, I'm going to swatch one of the most exciting shades in this palette, which is the shade Platinum Dusk, which is a metallic. And it's a metallic which feels very similar in texture to the taupe shade in the Voyeuristic Vixen Quad. There is something about this shade which reminds me of the formula of that shade. So far we've got 3 different formulas in here. We have the satin, we have the matte, and we have the formula from the Vixen Quad, which is not her molten metallic formula. It's not like the shades that are in Decadence. It feels a little bit different. It's very shiny, it's very sparkly, and it is such a beautiful taupe. And if I shine an artificial light on it, you can see that it's also very, very sparkly. This is a beautiful shade. I've wanted Pat to release a shade like this forever. I would have been slightly happier if she released a shade like this in her baked formula, but who knows, maybe someday. Next is another shade that I was extremely happy that we're getting, and that is the shade Extreme Nocturne. And Extreme Nocturne is a taupe brown matte shade. Again, very soft, very creamy. This is going to be absolutely beautiful for a nice cool toned look together with Platinum Dusk. The two already look so delicious together. The next shade is the shade Bronze Devotion. And Bronze Devotion looks like a somewhat cooler toned, neutral toned bronze shade. It is definitely much less warm toned compared to a bunch of her other bronze shades. And here we have a formula number 5, I think, because this feels more like her standard molten metallic shade. So think Decadence type of formula. I think this shade is going to please a lot of people who don't like their neutrals, especially their bronze shades, to be as warm toned as they have been in the past. And last but not least, before we start with the special shades, we have Plum Cabaret, which is the third matte shade in the palette, and it is your classic plum from Pat McGrath. I bet it's a hair different from all the other plums, but on the eye it's really not going to make such a difference. This reminds me a little bit of the tones of the plum shade in Divine Rose 2 the most, I think, and maybe in the Bridgerton 2 palette, but we're going to compare them later on. Alright, and now we're getting into the truly controversial territory. We're getting into the 4 special shades. So these are called VR, Astral and Blitz eyeshadows. In the past, Blitz, Astral and VR shades were always in her baked formula, so they had a completely different texture, a completely different feel to them, and they were made in a different way. A baked shade means that a liquid cream is poured into a pan and then it is baked in an oven. Whereas these are pressed, and the way you can tell that they are pressed is that they have metal pans around them. Usually her baked formulas are just poured into the pan and there is no metal pan surrounding it. If you want the details on that, check out my previous video, which is a guide to Pat McGrath's eyeshadow formulas, where I explain in detail what all of these baked Astral, VR and Blitz shades are all about. I already played around with these yesterday. I already have some preliminary thoughts about them. Let's start with the multi-chrome shifter. This is the shade VR Sextasy. VR Sextasy is a shade which shifts from like a reddish burgundy plum to a teal, and in some lights I can see also green flashes. And I know the first question that probably you are going to have is, does this shade feel like Rosefire Nectar from Voyeuristic Vixen, which was the first time she introduced these kind of like more shifty shades but not in a baked formula? And the answer is, I actually don't think so. Rosefire Nectar feels like a little bit softer, whereas this still has a little bit of that dryness and grit that you will be familiar with from her baked formulas. Now the next one is Astral Gold Lust. Astral shades in the past have always been some of her grittier, most sparkly eyeshadow formulas, and this again feels quite dry and quite gritty. You can also see on my finger, when you have it like this on your finger, it almost feels like the same type of texture that you get from the baked Astrals. It feels also rather lightweight. It's a bit reminiscent to her Astral formula, but then in a baked pan. The next shade is Blitz Venus. And in the past, her Blitz shades have been like a very smooth, very pigmented eyeshadow without too much glitter in it, that's meant to be like an opaque color. This is a... oh, sorry, I forgot to describe this shade. This shade, the shade Astral Gold Lust, is a cool toned gold. I'm going to swatch this next to a shade like Gold Standard or the gold shade from the Divine Rose 2 palette in a little bit, so that you can see how much more neutral and cool toned this is. Again, I think an eyeshadow that a lot of people are going to be pleased with because it is not as yellow toned as the quintessential Gold Standard. Then we have the shade, like I said, Blitz Venus, which is a cool toned champagne pink. This actually reminds me of Pink Champagne from Anastasia Beverly Hills quite a bit. It is indeed quite opaque. And again, there's a little bit of that dryness when you touch the eyeshadow. And the last eyeshadow in this palette is Astral Lilac Aura, which again, if you see like this gathered on the finger, reminds a little bit of the Astral shades with like those flakes and larger chunks of eyeshadow. And again, it feels rather lightweight. So there you have all the swatches of Moonlit Seduction. And Astral Lilac Aura, by the way, is like a more transparent base with pastel lilac sparkles in it. But the Astral Blitz and VR shades are actually rather sparkly, so I'm going to try to shine an artificial light here so that you can see. I hope that you're able to see it a little bit. They're very, very sparkly. Really pretty. Before I move into doing an eye look, I want to ramble a little bit about the non-baked Blitz VR and Astral shades, and I wanted to tell you about my experience yesterday and how I feel about it today. So yesterday, when I swatched these 4 shades, my first impression was complete and total disappointment. Because these shades are not baked, there is a lot more binder in them and they feel a lot denser in texture. They feel like they have much more texture to them. So an eyeshadow that is in her Astral formula but then baked feels light as air. These are probably as light as you're going to get in a non-baked formula. FYI, there are indeed 7 different formulas in here between the Astral Blitz VR and then the matte, the satin, the molten metallic and the Vixen type of metallic. There are indeed 7 different formulas in there. That was just an FYI. I can see all of these formulas in here indeed. But like I said yesterday, when I was watching them, even though they are light and they are not as, let's say, dimethicone and as silicone and as dense as an indie eyeshadow, what I did is, in order to get a little bit of a feel of how these eyeshadows compare to other formulas, I took out my actual Blitz Astral shades from other motherships that I have, and I also took out the JD Glow Galaxy eyeshadows and some Cliona eyeshadows, because these are my only reference for like more shifty, like really duochrome shades. And what I can tell you, these in terms of texture are still a world apart from the indie eyeshadows, because the indie eyeshadows still have a lot of like powderiness and that soft dimethicone feeling, whereas these, like I said, retain that dry, gritty texture that you're familiar with from her other mothership palettes, but they are denser. And because of that, because of how much denser they are, I'm a little bit afraid that they're not going to layer as nicely as her baked Astral Blitz and VR shades do, because like I said, the baked ones feel light as air. So when you have a molten metallic eyeshadow and then you dab a little bit of that baked Astral over top, you're not adding any additional texture. My fear is that because these have binder in them, they are going to add more texture to the lids. So those were a little bit my thoughts. Yesterday I felt really disappointed. Now when I was watching them again, I had the feeling that the 2 Astral shades do feel lighter in terms of texture, so maybe it would be possible to layer them. I think Blitz Venus is not meant to be layered because her Blitz shades are never really meant to be put as toppers. They are more of like an opaque color. The question with VR Sextasy is whether you can use that one to layer. I'm not sure, but I think it would be possible. It will just not be the same experience as a baked shade. So I really hope that she hasn't abandoned the baked formula. I don't think she has, because we have gotten 3 baked shades between the 2 Bridgerton palettes just this year. I don't know why these shadows are not baked, because it would seem like the perfect formula for them. I don't know what went down there. Is she trying something new? I sincerely hope she's not actually changing the formula of her eyeshadows to be this from now on, because I would be devastated, okay? I love her baked eyeshadows. I come to buy her palettes and invest so much money in them because of the versatility that these baked shadows give me. The difference in how they feel in terms of texture, the fact that they're something completely new to the table. These are still something different compared to every other formula that you have ever tried. But they're not the baked formula, okay? They're not the baked formula. So if you're an old school Pat McGrath fan and you love your baked eyeshadows, I don't know how you're going to feel about these. I'm a little bit iffy about them. I'll tell you in the end of coming week, when we have finished testing out this palette thoroughly, how I really feel about it, but I will still dearly miss just the feeling on my fingers of those baked formulas. And now I'm going to stop rambling, I'm going to zoom you in and we're going to do a look. I am going to start my first look on this side with the shade Rose Romantic because I'm kind of intrigued by this eyeshadow. I really hope that it's not going to come out looking too rosy and it's going to be more like a brick terracotta, like a rosewood color, instead of a straight up pinkish plumish color. Like I said, these feel pretty consistent with her other mattes. They are very soft, they blend out really easily. As you can see, I'm not really doing that much. I would have preferred this shade to have more brown tones to it, more like brown terracotta tones to it, because in my opinion it still leans a little bit pinker, although it is a cooler hue of pink. So it fits very nicely with the theme of the palette being a bit more cooler tone palette. Oh, and just to go back to the inspiration being moonlight and like moon themed things, where does the plum shade fit in that? I can see like the cool toned gold, the cool toned pink, the taupe shades would have been an absolute perfection, like other types of cooler toned eyeshadows would have fit perfectly in here, but where the fuck does a plum fit? I don't get it. If you have a very light skin tone, you're going to have to be careful when you work with this shade because it is somewhat deeper, but that's often the case with her matte eyeshadows because they're meant to be used across different skin tones. So this, if you're careful enough and you blend it out, I think you can blend it out to be a pretty like sheer wash of color, or you can build it up to have quite the like depth to it. I am going to go in with the shade that I fear the most because I don't think it's going to look very flattering on me, and that is the shade Plum Cabaret. I'm going to apply that into the outer corner of my eye. Yesterday when I swatched the two eyeshadows next to each other, I almost had a feeling that they're quite similar in tone, but they should be different because this is definitely a plum shade. I'm going to apply it in the usual sort of like winged out shape that I like to do. And I'm going to concentrate just a tiny bit here in the outer corner of the eye. When you start blending this shade out, you can definitely see quite strong reddish tones to it. So this is quite a red toned plum. Yeah, I'm just not the hugest fan of these types of shades on my eyes. I don't know that I will be using this shade specifically a lot. It is a nice shade, it blended out beautifully, I think it looks really nice. Again, it looks a bit too similar to the Rosewood shade. I just think that there tonally isn't that much difference between the two. There is a slight difference in their depth. I just don't understand these two mattes. I feel like one of them is redundant and one of them should have been a completely different shade, preferably statuesque. But okay, this applied very nicely, blended out very easily. Can't really say much more about that. While I'm at it, I'm also going to apply a little bit of this shade on my lower lash line right here in the outer portion of the eye anyway. You see, I think these kind of shades just make me look a bit tired. I don't know. I don't like these kind of shades. I'm going to take Intensifies now. Let's stick to Pat McGrath less. I'm going to take the Intensifies wand. And then we're going to go into these special shades. I'm going to sequentially go into VR's Ecstasy and then Blitz Venus. And I'm going to apply the VR shade more towards the center of the lid and the Blitz shade more towards the inner corner of the lid, the inner part of the lid. But it definitely is much denser and thicker in texture than her usual VR shades, which are much lighter. They are actually my favorite like baked formula from her. This is a glorious shade, but because of that strong burgundy plum undertones to it, like the base, again, it doesn't flatter me too much. I am going to try to use it layered over top of like the cooler toned eyeshadows in here, but like this on its own, it's very unlikely I'm going to use it much like that. And then I'm going to go into the Blitz shade and apply that next to that. Oh, this is beautiful. I really like the tone of this shade. Again, it's very, very different compared to the actual Blitz formula. In terms of opacity, it is very opaque, it's very shiny, but it definitely does not have the same texture as a Blitz shade. And then in the very inner corner of the lids, I'm just going to apply the Skin Tense Glow shade as intended by Dame Mother, here as an inner corner highlight. I don't know that there's much to comment about this kind of shades anymore. They're always in the palettes, they have subtle differences between each other, they all serve the same purpose, whatever. So far, I'm not really wowed, because there's really nothing so far to really wow me, not in terms of tones, not in terms of complexity, and not in terms of formula. So I have cleaned off my brush, and now I'm going to go into the shade Extreme Nocturne. And obviously I have doubts a little bit that this shade is going to blend out in my crease really well, so I am going to start applying it very lightly to see whether it's possible at all to use this shade as a, you know, lightly blended out crease shade, because for me this would be more like an outer corner deepening shade, but I don't want to use statuesque just yet. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to start building that up in the outer corner of the eye. I don't really want to make this more dramatic in my crease, so I'm just going to continue piling that Extreme Nocturne shade here with a pencil brush into my outer corners, just to create depth and definition there. I really like this shade. It reminds me a lot though of the taupe brown that we have in Midnight Sun, so I'm very curious to compare the two. I think this one may be just a little bit more gray. I'm also going to lightly pull this on my lower lash line. Okay, next I'm going to apply a little bit of the Intensifies wand here onto the rest of the lid and inner corner. And I am of course going to go into this glorious taupe shade, the shade Platinum Dusk, just using my fingers. I'm going to whack that on here. Oh, I really like this shade. Now I do want to try a little bit of layering, so I'm going to try to put that Astral Lilac Aura shade and just do what I would usually do with Astral shade, just pick a few flakes like this, and I will try to layer it over top of that taupe shade to see what happens. Giving a little bit of like a lilac hue to that taupe shade. Okay, this is probably not going to be the perfect choice for this look, but I really want to try the Astral Gold Lust shade, so the cool toned gold. I want to put that into my inner corners to see how it behaves. Oh, that looks pretty. I think I'm really going to like this shade on my lid with like browns surrounding it. Now to finish off the look on my lower lash line, I'm going to take the Bronze Devotion shade and just paint that onto the inner portion of my, well, not the inner, but like the middle portion of my lower lash line, just to get an idea how this shade looks like. Ooh, if I applied this shade on my lid, even with Extreme Nocturne, a bit of Statuesque, and then over top apply that Astral Gold shade, I think that might look really, really pretty. This look is now a bit all over the place because it doesn't know whether it wants to be a gold bronze or a taupe purple lilac, but I just wanted to test as many shades as possible. I think the shades that I'm really going to enjoy in this palette are all on this eye, whereas on this eye we have all the shades that I'm going to probably not be using as much. There's nothing wrong with that VR shade, it's just that I don't tend to like these sort of tones on myself. This shade reminds me very much of the eyeshadow that was present in one of her quads for Christmas 2021 that I decluttered because it was the same sort of like plummy burgundy tone that I didn't like. I think for science we need to shine an artificial light on these so you can see a little bit what's going on here. They're very, very shiny. I've applied some mascara and I've also cranked up my ring light just so you can see maybe a little bit more sparkle. So here we have the more like burgundy side. And here we have the more like taupey brown cool tone side. So where do I stand on the Moonlit Seduction overall so far? So far I am pretty lukewarm, but I think that's because I really need to get to know this palette a little bit more. I can tell you already now there are going to be shades that I'm really going to love and some that I'm not really going to be using that often. I can tell you for a fact I don't like this shade and I don't like this shade, but that is down to personal color preference. I will try to make this eyeshadow work by layering it, for example, over top of Platinum Dusk or other types of shades to see if I can make it work that way. Sans these two shades, I very much like the rest of what's going on in this palette because I think it is exactly what I said in the beginning. It is a cool toned neutral palette with a little bit of a glam twist to it. So if you wanted something that is a bit more toned down from Pat McGrath, a bit more office friendly, that you can still put the sparkle but still be very neutral, you're probably going to love this palette. In terms of the textures that are in here, I don't like the Blitz shade and I don't like the VR shade. I think they are very far off in terms of texture to what the baked shades will give you. I find this shade to be quite chunky and to create a bit of texture, so I don't know if it's going to work out to do layering with as you would normally be able to do with a VR shade. I don't like the Blitz shade because it lacks that lightness. It creates a little bit of texture on the lid. It looks just like any other indie chunky metallic eyeshadow, you know. I don't like it. I like the two Astrals. I think the two Astrals are probably the closest you're going to get to the baked formula because they have a little bit more of that lightness to them, and I think they might work for layering, and I do like both of these quite a bit and I cannot wait to try to layer these. The mattes are really nice. I like them. I really like Extreme Nocturne. The Rosewood shade, I'm a little bit more lukewarm about. Overall, I quite like this palette for what it is, a cool toned, more neutral palette with some considerations, as I mentioned. Okay, I want to compare that Plum Cabaret shade, so the Plum Matte, to a couple of other Plum Mattes in Pat McGrath's collection. Like I said, I feel like it reminds me a lot of the one in Divine Rose 2, so this one here. So let's swatch this one as well. Oh, this is much deeper in tone. I actually like this one a lot more. That's why I like Divine Rose 2 more. This is a lot deeper in tone and a lot more burgundy. I like this tone. I like this. This has too much reddish, purplish, maroon tones in it. Maroon. Maroon is the tone that I really don't like. And then we've got the first Bridgerton palette. So we've got this one. I think this one's going to be so much more cool toned and so much more grayed out, which is why I really, really like it. Yes, this is much different. And finally we have the one in the Bridgerton 2 palette. Again, has maybe more of those maroon tones that I don't like as much. I think this one may be the closest one to the one from Moonlit Seduction. Let's find out. Okay, this is Moonlit Seduction. This is the one from the Bridgerton palette. Again, this is more purple and this is more neutral in tone somehow. So let's watch the one from the Bridgerton palette here. Yeah, this to me is the closest one to this one. I still like the tone of this one slightly better, but on my eyes I dislike them almost equally. Okay, since I've got the Bridgerton 2 palette opened, I want to compare this shade, which is an actual Astral, to the Blitz shade from the Moonlit Seduction palette. So the shade, what is it called again? Blitz Venus, because I feel like they're really, really similar in tone. So this is the actual Astral, this is the Blitz shade. Again, they're different formulas. They are meant to be different. The Blitz shade is a much more opaque color, the Astral is a sparkle. So they're not meant to be the same in terms of texture. But here I just want to compare the color. This is Bridgerton. And this is the one from Moonlit Seduction. This one is actually much more cool toned. I wanted to swatch the gold shade from Moonlit Seduction. Disregard the textures and the formula. I just wanted to show you a gold from Pat McGrath that is truly really, really much more yellow. So that is the one over here from the Divine Rose 2 palette. And last I want to take also as a reference the quintessential gold standard. Again, a very different formula. This is a molten metallic, just to show you the color tone difference. So this is the gold from Moonlit Seduction, this is the one from Divine Rose 2, and this is Gold Standard. Look how much more cool toned and almost silvery looking this is. This almost doesn't even look like a gold. It is a gold, but not quite as warm toned. It's so much more neutral and cool. I love the ones from Divine Rose 2 and Gold Standard. I love me a good warm toned gold, but I know it's not everyone's preference. This is quite yellow, this has a bit more orange in it, and this is clearly so much more neutral and cool toned. I want to put the Astral from the Bridgerton 1 palette next to that Astral Lilac Aura shade from Moonlit Seduction, because I feel like they're maybe the closest. This one being so much more like silvery. The one from Bridgerton still has some blue sparkle to it, but I think they're relatively similar-ish. This is much more like a lighter, more pastel lilac tone, and it doesn't have any blue. Just to show you how much more indeed cool toned also this shade is, I want to take the shade Bronze Devotion and compare it to another shade from Pat McGrath, which is literally called Bronze, and it's this shade over here. Again, you see so much more cool toned, neutral, compared to Bronze, which is almost like an orange. So again, so much more cooler tones. My hand is now a bit wet, so these are going to play really foiled. But as you can see, huge difference. This is like a very cool toned, browny, bronzy goodness that I don't think she has made before. She has given us this beautiful Platinum Dusk shade here. So I want to compare this to other sort of like taupes that she has in her collection. So let's watch Platinum Dusk here. And now I want to open up my Decadence palette, because there are two taupe shades in there. This one, which is the shade Divine Mink, which is, I think it's so much deeper and a completely different type of eyeshadow. And this one that I don't know the name of, but it's also like a neutrally taupey shade. They're still quite different, I feel like. Divine Mink is obviously going to have a much darker base, and it's much more of like a brown gray. This is more of like a grayish green almost. And then we have the Satin shade. Oh, this is actually a bit closer to the new one that we're getting, but this has maybe even more green tones than this one. And since the texture is also quite similar, let's grab the Voyeuristic Vixen Quad and swatch this shade, which is another like taupey shade. I don't remember the name of this shade. Twilight Bronze. Oh no, this is supposed to be a bronze shade. Well, to me this is more like a taupey brown, but it's so much warmer compared to Platinum Dusk. The formula though is the same, it feels the same to me. A really important palette that I want to drop for comparison purposes here is Subliminal, because I think this VR shade here is very similar to that VR Sextasy shade. So I feel like this shade is like a cousin of the VR Sextasy shade, but just slightly different. This is a bit more rosy pink, magenta. The VR shade from Subliminal is much more of a blue duochrome, whereas this one is almost more green, which I really like. I like that this has greener, like a greener sparkle to it. So here we have VR, whatever it's called, from the Subliminal palette, and this is the new shade. But I think I also want to show you if you can see the difference in how these eyeshadows apply. This is smooth, it has a bit of transparency to it, it has that beautiful sparkle and shift, so you can easily layer this over top of other eyeshadows. This is so much more dense and chunky. I just don't feel like the two can serve the same purpose. While we're at it, there is a taupey brown in Subliminal, so let's swatch that next to Extreme Nocturne. Extreme Nocturne, and this is the one from Subliminal. These two are actually quite similar. I feel like on the eye they're going to achieve the exact same purpose and nobody can tell the difference. While we're at it and we have the Subliminal palette, I want to show you what an actual Blitz shade looks like. This is the texture of a Blitz shade. Look how smooth and like silk this looks like in the pan. And this is the Blitz shade we're getting in the new palette. This one here. See how smooth this is and how much more textured and chunky this is? I don't like it. Can you see the difference in the texture? They're just worlds apart. Okay, and last but not least, let's swatch the cool toned brown taupe that's in the Midnight Sun palette, because there is one of those in here as well. I'm curious how it compares to the taupe shade from Moonlit Seduction right here. If you're seeing any sparkle in here, it's because I just used a finger that had a lot of glitter on it. Apologize for that. This is actually quite much deeper and more gray, almost like a gray-black, whereas these two are truly like brown taupes, with this one being a bit more gray and this one maybe being a bit more brown. And since I have this palette open, I wanted to show you that the Astral shades are the ones that feel the most similar in terms of texture. So let me pick up a little bit of Astral Solstice, and then I'm going to pick up a little bit of the two Astrals from Moonlit Seduction, so this one and this one, so that you can tell that even on the finger they seem to have a very similar texture to them. You see, this is the closest that they have gotten with the pressed shadows. Let's quickly swatch them here. They retain a little bit of like sheerness and that sparkle, so I think the Astral formula is pretty close. The other two, not even a little bit. Okay, I'm going to call it quits with all the comparison swatches. I think that was enough. I think I've rambled enough. I think I've made a lot of my feelings very, very clear, and I'm going to have a much more round up, thought out opinion at the end of next week after I have worn Moonlit Seduction a couple of times. In the meantime, thank you so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you have purchased this palette and used it a little bit, do let me know what your thoughts on this are. If, by the way, I have forgotten any comparisons that you wanted to see, do let me know and I will just do it throughout the week that we're doing looks with this palette. I will of course tell you all about my holidays very, very soon. And yeah, that's pretty much all. Bye!